Okay, I think we'll start. Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Roy Idelson, president of the Society for the Study of Peace, Conflict, and Violence, which is Division 48 of the American Psychological Association. Today is our third webinar in this year's series on resisting oppression and pursuing justice. I'm really pleased that our guest today is Dr. Stephanie Savell, a public anthropologist who, for many years, has been researching militarism, security and insecurity, and activism in relation to the U.S. post 9/11 wars. Dr. Savell is currently a senior fellow at Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs, where she is the director of the Costs of War Project. Under her leadership, the Costs of War Project has produced research cited in thousands of media articles and broadcasts. Since 2017, Dr. Savell has regularly updated a global map of U.S. counterterrorism operations. She is co-author of the book, The Civic Imagination, Making a Difference in American Political Life. And in addition to her academic publications, she has written for media outlets such as The Guardian, Foreign Policy, Newsweek, and Axios. I'm also pleased that my colleague, Serdar M. Değirmencioglu, president-elect of our society, has agreed to facilitate a conversation with Dr. Savell. Serdar is very much an activist public scholar with a background in developmental, community, and peace psychology. He has been studying militarism for 2 decades. In 2014, he published a groundbreaking book on martyrdom and militarism in Turkey. His most recent book documents resistance and solidarity at the universities there. Serdar has also been writing a weekly column focused on children's rights, well-being, and peace in a daily newspaper in Turkey since 2008. He is currently a visiting scholar at the IMT School for Advanced Studies in Lucca, Italy. With that background, I'll now turn things over to Serdar and Stephanie. Please post your questions in the Q&A box as we go, and hopefully we'll get to them before the hour is over. Okay, over to you, Serdar and Stephanie. Thanks.
Thank you, Roy. It's a pleasure for me to have Stephanie join our webinar series. And it's been, I don't exactly remember how long since I've been interested in the project that Stephanie is leading at this point. But this project is extremely important in multiple ways. And this is what we are going to do today, to explore the different contours of this very important project. And once again, this is a very important topic, and in fact, a very unpleasant topic to be talking about, but I'm extremely happy that Stephanie was able to join. And she thought that it would be a good idea for us to have a conversation format rather than a straight sort of PowerPoint-based presentation. Therefore, I will be exploring 4 themes with her, and I will try to squeeze in 2 more questions that I think are extremely important. Okay, so let's start with the very beginning of this project. How did it all begin? In what context did the Costs of War Project begin?
Yes, and thank you all for having me. I'm very happy to be here in conversation with you all. It's not often that I get to be in conversation with psychologists in the Psychological Association, so it's great to be opening this line of exchange, and I do welcome all of your questions. So thanks again for having me. I have been co-directing the Costs of War project since 2017, and it was founded by my two what were co-directors, Catherine Lutz and Nita Crawford. Catherine Lutz is an anthropologist. Nita Crawford is a political scientist. I'm an anthropologist. And it's always been an interdisciplinary collective effort. It's a group of scholars who founded the project. It's housed at Brown University. At this point, we have over 70 contributors who are scholars and experts from across the US and around the world. The project was founded back when Nita and Kathy founded it in 2011. And at the time, it was 10 years into what we call the post 9/11 wars, what George W. Bush called the global war on terror. Um, and there was very little public conversation about these wars in the United States. The media hardly talked about it. There was very little critical thinking or coverage or questioning of the fact that the United States was at war at all. And so the project was founded to change that, to get research about the post 9/11 wars into the public eye, to promote the kinds of critical thinking and questioning that wasn't being done. And, always with a foundation in very rigorous evidence-based research and using that research to contribute in the ways that I've described. So now I'm the director of the project. I've taken over in the past couple of years. And when I came on board in 2017, what we were doing was really putting research on a website. We were putting research, making research papers available. It was, important work at the time. And when I started, I thought, we can do a lot more to connect this information to the people who are using it to make change. We all know that research is not going to change anyone's minds really or course of action. But the people who are changing minds, the people who are making policies, they use research as a really important tool for movement building and change. And so we started reaching out to 3 particular audiences with our research findings. The first was journalists and editors and media outlets. And so every time we publish a paper, we do a great deal of outreach to the press. We write press releases. We often try to get exclusives that cover our research, which means that there's hopefully a high profile outlet that covers it first. And oftentimes when a high profile outlet does that, then the other outlets follow. We do a lot of social media. Traditionally, Twitter was a place where there were a lot of journalists. And that's still the case, although, of course, things are rapidly shifting. So we have a presence on Instagram and Facebook, Blue Sky, and YouTube. We have a growing email list. So we're always trying to reach out to journalists in different ways. We also reach out to educate policymakers. So we have an active outreach. We send emails to a list of congressional offices, and we never do lobbying because we're a research group, but we do awareness raising and education. We'll host briefings for congressional staff. Sometimes we do, before COVID, we did some physical events on the Hill. And since then, we've mostly been doing webinars, but we'll do kind of really targeted outreach webinars intended specifically for congressional staff. And we get a fair amount of turnout. And then we do our third main audience for our work is civil society. So we reach out to social movements and civil society groups, and we try to create kind of digestible research takeaways for those groups that they can use in their advocacy for peace, for social justice, against militarism, reducing the Pentagon budget, and other goals that will promote equality and a reduction in violence.
Wonderful. You actually opened the door and partly answered the question that I had, my second question, and that had to do with the audience and the methods you use to reach that audience. So your project is in many ways combining research with this rather extraordinary outreach. So can you expand on that?
Yeah,
It's an interesting method for many researchers who are interested in action.
it is. I think it can be replicated in on many topics. You know, it's a replicable model. And actually, I wrote an article that's published in the American Anthropologist with Catherine Lutz, who's one of my co-founders, about exactly, it kind of outlines the details of our methods and kind of lays it out in that exact way. Like people working on many different topics can use these kinds of methods to build a public scholarship and activist research profile. So, you know, we are, I think our research at this point is well known and well used, you know, in many parts of the world. But we draw a particular boundary around our work in terms of audience, and that is a pragmatic one because we're American researchers. We're working in the United States, and so while there are many harmful militarisms, many kinds of imperial violence, we focus in particular on the United States as opposed to any other, you know, violent actor, and that is because. You know, I think for a long time, it was fair to say that we had the privilege of working in a democracy with freedom of speech and where there, you know, what we could do was work to hold the government accountable for doing better, for killing less people, for having less harmful policies, for being less, you know, suffering the consequences less of many different kinds of costs, right? We look at the costs, not just economic costs, but social, political, environmental, human costs of US militarism. So, you know, obviously, a lot is in flux right now with U.S. foreign policy, with the nature of U.S. Democracy. So what I'm saying is mostly, mostly I have to say, like before the current administration, and we're still, you know, figuring out what the current administration means for the ways that we operate. But yeah.
Thank you. One question that I wanted to squeeze in, I think is a very important question. When we're discussing major efforts such as the project that you're involved in and you're directing, sometimes we don't talk about the individual who is in it and playing a very central role. And for instance, in my case, I have been very interested in militarism because I'm from Turkey. And the history of Turkey is shaped by militarism. And in many ways, and this is not an exaggeration, my life has been shaped by militarism. And every single young man in Turkey has to serve in the army. And when I served briefly, I came across people who did incredible things to avoid serving, which was an important lesson. And when I became a scholar, very quickly I started studying militarism this and that way. And because it was all around me, it was almost impossible for me to. But so over the last 2 decades, I have never stopped studying militarism. So I was curious as to how you got interested in militarism, the very beginnings of your own interest.
Yeah, well, thank you for asking that. And I can really understand what you're saying. It's one of the reasons why I think, you know, having a conversation is so valuable. Um, my personal story as an anthropologist, I did my PhD work in Brazil, actually. I lived in a favela, which is an informal settlement in Rio de Janeiro. And I did my work on police violence. And at the time, it was, 2011, 2012, the Brazilian military was taking action in these urban neighborhoods. And so I was looking at those kinds of questions about militarism. I came to that because had been working in favelas for a while, and I was just interested in the things that the kind of most pressing political things that were affecting people's lives, that people were talking about, that kept them up in the night, and that was the biggest kind of political factors on an individual, affecting individuals, as you're saying. And it was by far this question of police violence, and the army having occupied their neighborhood. And so I came to the topic in that way. I lived for a year in a place where people had to be scared of, flying bullets from the police fights between the police and the gangs who lived there, where people felt that they didn't have freedom of speech. They were afraid to post freely on social media. They were stigmatized in the broader city, with a combination of kind of race and class, but also just the fact that they were in a place that was accused of harboring these gangs. Everyone was, in the other parts of the city, they see favela residents as kind of potentially criminals, right? All of them. So it's a combination of all those factors where they suffer a lot of discrimination, and it has to do with state militarism. And then I worked under, as I said, Catherine Lutz was my dissertation advisor, and she's a very well-known anthropologist of U.S. militarism. And so when it came time to figuring out what my work to be, I was very passionate about being a public scholar. And I wanted my research to make a difference, not just theoretically, but practically, and to be able to really use research as a tool for change, is what I'm really passionate about. And so I realized that if I wanted to be a public scholar, that I would have to shift my focus to the United States, because I'm an American, and that just makes sense that Americans are going to be more concerned with U.S. policy than Brazilian policy, right? So I made that shift at that time and began studying U.S. militarism, and yeah.
Okay, thank you. Um, Perhaps we should go to the perhaps most interesting question of this webinar, which has to do with profound yet subtle or indirect costs of war. And this is very important because most of the time, most audiences and even most policymakers tend to focus on so-called direct consequences of war. And your project has done a very good job in not just highlighting, but explaining and actually coming up with new ways of showing the very profound and long-lasting effects of war or consequences of war. So can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So there are many ways that this happens. And the thing that I'll focus on for now is a research paper that I put out in 2023, less than a couple years ago, called "How Death Outlives War: The Reverberating Consequences of the Post 9/11 Wars." And so the idea is that, as you say, the focus is often on direct, and this is a term from public health and epidemiology, the direct death count, the people who die from, as we say, bullets and bombs and fire and direct war violence. What many people don't know is that far more people die through, again, what public health experts call indirect death. And these are the reverberating consequences of war. Wars contaminate the environment, they force people to leave their homes, they collapse economies, public services, infrastructure, and these consequences lead to mass impoverishment, loss of access to food, clean water, healthcare, medicine, and other essential pathways to preserving health and life. And these effects in turn lead to indirect war deaths, the large majority of which occur due to malnutrition, pregnancy and birth-related problems, and many illnesses, including both infectious diseases and diseases like cancer. And some also result from injuries and for example, through reverberating consequences like the destruction of traffic signals, things we would never think about for those of us who live outside war zones, and from reverberating trauma and interpersonal violence, which I think is particularly relevant for all of you. So I'm going to share my screen. This is a infographic that we developed to share the findings of this report, of my report. So this, I think, is, if you will take just a minute to look at this carefully, because there's a lot of information packed in here. But here you see at the top direct war deaths that I mentioned, the direct violence. And here is this arrow explaining all these indirect war deaths. And you can see what public health experts call causal pathways to indirect death. So here's economic collapse and food insecurity. Next is public services and health infrastructure destruction. Next is environmental contamination. And then next is reverberating trauma and violence. And then, of course, those were the main categories I explored, but then there are, of course, other impacts that my paper didn't cover. It was a very big paper as it was. All of these lead to disease, malnutrition, injury, maternal and newborn complications. And then we have a couple things here. Internal displacement, people being displaced, forcibly displaced, especially within their own countries. This increases people's vulnerability to all the negative health effects. And the reason the internal displacement is statistically correlated with negative health effects is because if you become a refugee abroad, it's not a desirable thing either way to be forcibly displaced by violence, of course. But if you make it across borders, it's more likely that you'll be supported in, for example, refugee camp of some sort. And this isn't true across the board. It's just that statistically, the correlation is that if you're internally displaced, it leads to a lot worse health ramifications. And then something that people don't know, which is that wars disproportionately kill women and children more than men, and children above all, because of these reverberating consequences, these causal chains. And what I mean by that is that children between the ages of 0 to 5 are most likely to die through the reverberating effects of war. And that's because they're the most vulnerable population to malnutrition and disease. I can tell you a story. For example, I went to, a few years back, I was doing field research in Burkina Faso, which is suffering from a very big conflict related to militant violence and government war against attacking what they're calling terrorists. I went to a refugee camp, internally displaced camp, people who weren't even registered with the government because the government didn't want to admit that there were internally displaced people in Ouagadougou, which is the region of the capital. And so these people were living in the most precarious conditions you can imagine. They were eating only once a day on the handouts, the charity of surrounding villages who themselves were just living hand to mouth. There was a little boy I heard about who, he got malaria, which is a treatable disease if you're taken to the doctor and given medicine. And he was so malnourished and they had so little resources that by the time they set up a group collection effort and got him to the doctor, he was so anemic from the malnutrition that he died. It didn't matter that he was taken to the doctor because malnourishment really actually makes you more prone to getting infectious diseases. And then when you get them, more prone to dying. So this little boy was 5 years old, and he's one of the many, many uncounted, unrecorded, unnamed deaths, the consequences of these sorts of wars. So let me just see here what else I wanted to tell you about this. Again, my focus, as all of our focus in the Cost of War project, is on the U.S. post 9/11 wars. So I looked in particular at the places that have been the hotspots of the violence after 9/11. In Afghanistan, particularly, for example, when I did this research, the statistic that at the time, 95% of Afghans were not getting enough to eat. In women-headed households, that's 100% not getting enough to eat. 3.9 million children were acutely malnourished or wasting, which means insufficiently intaking essential nutrients with serious physiological consequences, and 1 million Afghan children at risk of death due to wasting. There's also the destruction of healthcare, which has particularly far-reaching effects. And this is another slide we developed, another infographic we developed for my paper. So how war's destruction of healthcare leads to indirect deaths over time. There are the immediate effects of war. Hospitals are bombed, healthcare workers threatened, patients prevented from seeking care due to the fear of violence, supply chains of medicine and equipment disrupted. Then you get to the medium-term effects. Access to healthcare is limited, the quality of care decreased, the healthcare workforce is stressed, vaccine administration disrupted, etc. And then you get to the long-term effects: increased maternal and newborn mortality, disease-related death, and other population-level health effects. Oops, this is what I'm going to do right now is stop sharing for a minute and go back to our conversation just like this. Okay, so the environmental effects are things like uranium in the soil, contaminated soil, water, vegetation. The explosive weapons are destroying buildings, releasing asbestos. There are industrial chemicals, fuels, and other hazards, destroyed water and sanitation facilities, leading to pollution from sewage. And there's been research that shows that, for example, medical doctors in Fallujah, Iraq, are reporting high rates of miscarriage, premature birth, birth defects, congenital anomalies, and cancer. And a researcher, an anthropologist named Kali Rubai, was told by an interlocutor in Iraq, we often say that every family includes someone with cancer. So this is a 43-year-old man. So here I'm going to get to that last causal pathway that I described, the reverberating trauma and violence. This is particularly understudied in the post 9/11 war zones and all wars. And here I'm talking about how living through war and forced displacement is traumatic, with long-lasting impacts on mental health, which can lead to suicide and increased domestic, sexual, and other kinds of interpersonal violence. You know, guns are more circulating in war zones, and the rising rates of crime are part of this interpersonal violence that I'm talking about. Another anthropologist, a lot of the research that I put together all the kind of public health research that I could, but I put it together with a lot of anthropological research, because in places where you can't get the statistical research and the numbers, you can get the more anecdotal research. So that's why I'm going to pull in quotes and that kind of thing. But there's an anthropologist, Anila Delatsai, who's done a lot of work in Afghanistan. And they told her things like, I don't even taste food anymore. I wish this life would just end.
Yeah.
I hit my child. She doesn't do anything wrong. Hopefully Allah will forgive me, one man told her. And another man said to her, there's something wrong with me. They knew what they were doing. They were committing domestic violence, but in the face of their PTSD, they felt helpless to stop their violence against their own family members. So, these mental health effects reverberate through generations. They're impacting parents and their children after that. Globally, estimates are that anxiety and depression are 2 to 4 times greater among conflict-affected populations than the global average. In 2009, which is the first and only government mental health survey in Iraq, it showed that 17% of adults suffered from a mental health disorder in their lifetime, with a large percentage of the cases related to the period following the 2003 US invasion. Women tend to suffer most acutely in some ways, in the sense of the rise in gender-based violence, which is heightened in wartime. In Iraq, for example, rape and sexual violence increased sharply after 2003. 1 in 5 Iraqi women has suffered physical or psychological abuse since then. And, one result is that women tend to suffer greater burden of negative mental health effects. Children are also particularly vulnerable. And research shows that children who experience high levels of collective violence, as in warfare, are twice as likely to develop chronic diseases. A 2014 survey in Mosul, Iraq, showed that 4 out of 10 school children had mental health disorders such as PTSD. A 2010 study documented Iraqi children experiencing depression, anxiety, aggressive behavior, and multiple phobias. And children are also deeply affected, as you all know, by caregiver mental health issues such as depression and PTSD and the breakdown of family structures. Again, turning back to this researcher, Anila Delatsai, her work has shown how Afghans turn to heroin as a way to cope with the traumas of war. And while drug abuse may hasten their deaths, some Afghans perceive heroin as a way of what Anila says in quotes, making life not death, because it is the only way that they can continue to live in the context of serial losses and the suffering of 40 years of war, not just the US-led war, but the civil war that preceded it. In Pakistan, between 2004 and 2010, the US conducted what they call double tap drone strikes, most on Pashtun villages in North and South Waziristan along the Afghan border, in which a second strike follows an initial strike against survivors who go to the site to rescue the injured and the dead. And reports documented the residents of these regions suffering from PTSD, chronic anxiety, and constant fear. A local resident explained, in quotes, God knows whether they'll strike us again or not, but they're always surveying us. They're always over us, and you never know when they're going to strike and attack. There's more. in Syria. I mean, the list goes on. But those are the kind of the data that I was able to capture from this very broad, what I called a live literature review. So I used all the literature I could find, plus I interviewed a lot of scholars. And that was kind of the data that I was able to put together from those sources on the mental health effects of the post 9/11 wars in particular. And you can clearly extrapolate to other wars. Yeah, so that's what I'll say in answer to your question.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me add, as we're talking about the indirect consequences, I have a list of, actually a long list of names of children who ended up dying because they were curious. As you well know, children often go places when they're playing and they poke their noses into different places as they explore the environment. And if they find something that appears to be very strange, very interesting, they may actually want to handle it. And that might be an unexploded grenade.
Yeah.
So there's this long list of children who died that way in Turkey.
That's right.
And the establishment, the government, never claims any responsibility for that. So these grenades and these unexploded ammunitions, whatever they might be, ended up there just because. So as you emphasized, particularly the consequences for children are immense and tragic.
That's right. Yeah, we have a
Okay.
paper that deals with this question of unexploded ordnance in Afghanistan in particular, and it has the statistics of numbers of people who are maimed and tells stories about that. But you're right, it's often children who are going out, and a lot of times it's in rural areas. They're going out to collect firewood and water and things like that, and they get maimed or killed in the process.
Yeah. And just one more example before we turn to the other question. I was a visiting scholar in Frankfurt until last year, and there are areas in Frankfurt that people don't go to, and they don't necessarily know why these areas are not visited much. Turns out these are areas that are contaminated. They used to be areas where there was a lot of military action, both from the Nazi and both from the US military. They were contaminated, so they're not used. And very few people know that they are not used even after 70, 80 years. It's very interesting. Okay, so let me turn to the other very striking findings of your project. It's, I think, more recent, and that has to do with the federal force and how the federal force in the United States is in many ways devoted to militarism. And I have shared this particular finding from your project in various talks that I have given, particularly last year. So could you please expand on this?
Sure, yeah. This and based on our conversation we had before, I know exactly what paper you're talking about, and it actually also was published in 2023, although it's going to be updated soon. But it was authored by my colleague, who's also actually on the staff of the Cost of War Project at this point. She works at Brown University too, and she's an economist. Her name is Heidi Peltier, and the paper is called "We Get What We Pay For: The Cycle of Military Spending, Industry Power, and Economic Dependence." And she looks at the question of economic dependence in the United States on through two lenses: money and jobs. There are two ways of that, as an economist, she kind of gets at how our economy in the United States has been shaped by militarism and war. So I wanted to, again, I'll share my slide. I share a slide with you here. Hold on. Okay. So here's a table from this paper in which you can see in particular the statistic that you're mentioning, Serdar. It's federal civilian, note civilian employment, right? This doesn't even count the uniform members of the armed forces. Those are separate. But this is the civilian employment, and it's looking at the numbers of employees in all the US government departments. And it shows raw numbers in the first column and as a percentage of total civilian employee workforce. So you can see the Department of Defense employs 34% of civilian employees. Next, Veterans Affairs, 20%. Next, Homeland Security, 10%. Those together, those three departments, Defense, Veterans Affairs, and Homeland Security, are all part and parcel of the same apparatus. This is what, the US euphemistically calls defense, but in other language could be called war. Right. So it's the by and large making up the majority of the federal civilian workforce. The other agencies follow. And this is part of these broader trends that Heidi looks at. And here you can see military spending compared to other federal spending priorities over time. In orange, you can't see those, perhaps those the small text at the bottom. But basically in orange is national defense. This is the discretionary budget. And then everything else, all the other departments of the United States government are the lines at the bottom. So defense is really, really the lion's share of US discretionary spending. And here it's important to say, there's a difference between discretionary spending in the United States and mandatory spending. Mandatory government spending is the things that the government must spend on every year, including Medicare and Social Security, although, of course, again, under the current administration, that is changing. But the discretionary spending is the budget that gets negotiated between the executive branch and Congress every year. It's what gets, the president approves and Congress proposes. Or wait, anyway, I don't quote me on that. I think there's approvals and proposals, and anyway, it's negotiated. So in any case, the discretionary spending is the lion's share. And then the last thing I had was this is this perpetual cycle. This is what Heidi is arguing in this paper. So here we can start at the top. Increased military spending. Basically, other elements and capacities of the US government and the civilian economy are weakened as a result of this really high levels of military spending. And what happens is then military industries gain political power. Right? The contractors make a lot of profit, and then there's a lot of power. And what happens is they gain more money, they gain more political clout, they use it for lobbying. In the past few years, there were something like 700 lobbyists for the defense industry every year over the past 5 years. There are 500 plus members of Congress. So that's more than one lobbyist for the defense industries than every single member of Congress. And so all of this kind of strengthens the cycle, right? Decades of high levels of military spending have changed US government and society. They're strengthening the ability to fight wars and weakening capacity to perform other core functions. Investments in infrastructure, healthcare, education, emergency preparedness all suffer as military spending and industry crowds them out. And then increased resources channeled to the military further increase that cycle of economic dependence. So the militarized sectors of the economy see perpetual increases in funding and manpower while other human needs go unmet. So it's a really distorted functioning that comes at really high cost to the kind of U.S. society and the more balanced functioning of government. So I will stop sharing there.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you. I think we have some people who are waiting to ask questions, but before they go, I would like to ask my very last question, which is actually a question that I get asked, sometimes overtly, sometimes in subtle ways. And the question has to do with you as a psychologist. Why do you study militarism? Why is it any of your business? There are other things that mainstream psychologists do. Why don't you do those things? So in your case, I'm very interested in you expanding on why an anthropologist would become an anthropologist of militarism.
I care deeply about equality. I care deeply about humans, individual stories of people in the war zones affect me really deeply. I feel very passionately about justice and that every human life matters. Every human life, including people who are not Americans and who are not white and who don't have any kind of privilege or power. So often I think the US public discourses doesn't follow that. The US news about the signal chat leak, where there was a Atlantic editor was included on a top secret defense thread, right? Was the scandal in the US became national security breach or not, right? That was what the discussion was about. It wasn't about the fact that what the people on the thread were talking about was bombing Yemen, killing people. Over 50 people reportedly died in those US strikes on Yemen. The US has been bombing Yemen every day since March 15th, when this latest wave of strikes started. And to me, as someone who really, I'm just astounded that there isn't more conversation about those lives that are being lost. If the conversation were started from the premise that all human lives are equal, then it would be an entirely different conversation, wouldn't it? But as it is, I think Americans treat those Yemeni lives as they don't matter, And so when I give talks and do media work, I always try to bring it back to the level of the human beings who are impacted, the people who are, addicted to heroin in Afghanistan, the children like the little boy in Burkina Faso who I described, because I think we need to humanize these conversations that so often are conducted by, sorry, but white men and the policy wonks and all of the kind of spheres of society where that those dehumanized conversations happen. Yeah. But thank you for asking. People don't often ask me that question. Maybe that's the difference in talking to the Psychological Association.
No, I think it is a very important disciplinary issue at the same time. It is often the case that people, I sometimes call it shackled by disciplinary shackles. And my response to the very question that I asked you in many ways summarizes what you told us. And that is, if you care deeply about people, if you care deeply about a very important burning issue, you disregard disciplinary boundaries. You make your scholarship change or suit the needs of this particular topic that you're interested in. And therefore, you do what you do, but in a different way so that you can serve better. And in my case, I think I should be serving the public. And that's what my research or my scholarship is for.
Yeah, me too.
Thank you. And that I think might be a good point to turn it over to Roy, because Roy has been doing the very same thing over so many years. I don't want to go into how many years, but a long time. Roy, it's your turn.
Am I back?
Yes, you are.
Um, this has been great. I mean, really not uplifting exactly, but really, but how could it be? And but really important and powerful in what you've described, Stephanie, and Serdar, and what you have shared as well. Um I'm looking to see what questions we have. Um, and a lot of appreciation rather than mostly questions. Um, I just want to make an observation, which and see if you have thoughts about it. You know, one of the things psychology in the United States is somewhat unique. Actually, nothing can be somewhat unique, but that's a slip. Um, in that we, as a profession, we depended upon war. Basically, it was the World War One and especially World War Two that made psychology a way in which people could earn a living in the United States. Psychologists, for the first time, were involved in the selection of soldiers for specific missions. They were involved in, well, I guess what I'll call as propaganda to support war efforts, kind of formulating how best to persuade the public to, you know, to support these endeavors. And they were certainly involved in caring for veterans and soldiers who suffered psychologically as a result of their war experience. So we're in a challenging position, and as Serdar and others here know, um, you know, peace psychology, our division is one of the smaller ones. It's um, the Department of Defense and Veterans Affairs uh, are among the very largest employers of psychologists. Um, so I kind of look to anthropology as, you know, I wish we could get there because I'm a little familiar with the network of concerned anthropologists, and I know that anthropology took a strong stand in regard to the human terrain system
Yeah,
work.
because anthropologists were employed by the military, especially during the counterinsurgency thrust in, 2010, 2011 in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Right. And the American Anthropological Association, I think, said no.
No, exactly.
Right. This is
Not support
inconsistent.
this. This is not okay. Yeah.
Right. Um, we in psychology haven't gotten there. The best we have done is to kind of almost say that, well, let's say that psychologists should not be involved in torture. This is not a,
It's the bare minimum, right?
yeah, I would say so. So it's just kind of, um, there's no question there. I'm just kind of offering some perspective of, you know, where psychology in the United States especially fits into this. And we hope to do better.
It's a challenge for all of our fields, how much the money the Department of Defense has in terms of employment capacity and funding for research. We have to be careful in our educational work on Capitol Hill, for example, not to jeopardize any, funding streams for the medical school and that kind of thing. Because it's part of that, the political power that I was talking about. It's what President Eisenhower called the military industrial complex. It's something that we need to be aware of, and we need to be active in the face of, to change the sorts of structural systems. And again, I think that's where anthropology and other social sciences differ from psychology, is our emphasis on structures rather than individuals, right? And the systems that need to change. So you, as psychologists, are working within structures that make organizing difficult. And so I think awareness of those structures, and the political economics of it, the money and the power that comes of those systems, is a place to start. I think these kinds of conversations are the right ones to be having if you do want to change the way things are working within your discipline.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
I guess time flies.
Yeah.
I want to, so I'll draw things to a close. I want to thank Stephanie and Serdar for, again, a really valuable discussion. And my thanks to everyone who's attended as well. As I noted, we do plan to host a webinar every month on topics related to resisting oppression and pursuing justice. And if you're a member of our society, Division 48, you'll be receiving an email announcement with further information about each of these webinars. If you're not a member, we'd love to have you join us. You don't have to be a member of the American Psychological Association in order to be a member of our society. And if you want to do that right away, you can do that you can go to peacepsychology.org and you'll find how to join.
And may I also plug the Costs of War project? We have an email listserv you can sign up for. So if you go to our website, Costs of War, costs with an S, of war.org, you'll find a button where you can sign up for our emails, and then you can stay abreast of all of our latest research.
Great. And I should give either of you the final word. If you have anything more to say.
I really appreciated the conversation. Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Roy.
I really did too. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to talk.
Great. Take care,
Thank you.
everyone. Bye.
Bye now.